All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons. Thanks so much for tuning into the program. Believe it or not, this is our 200th episode. I had no idea how many episodes I was going to get through when I started this show in 2014, but we're at 200, and that to me is kind of a little bit of a milestone. You know, I'm a historian, so I like to mark time and mark moments in time, and this one seems important to me because, you know, as the Nostalgia Trap celebrates our 200th episode, a lot of the things that we've been talking about since 2014 are just popping off in terms of world political discourse. And so that's been really fun to sort of track the show over the course of current events, because that was really partly why I started the show. I started the Nostalgia Trap at the tail end of my experience studying American history at the City University of New York, Graduate Center in New York City. And really my main thought was, you know, podcasts were kind of new. I didn't really even know how to do them, but I really wanted to share the insights that I was exposed to in graduate school. I'm a person that, you know, my family, I've talked about many times, I'm a first generation PhD. So a lot of these insights are new to me, or were new to me. And I thought, well, you know, people shouldn't have to enroll in PhD programs or be part of academia in order to gain to see the value of these insights and to gain something from them. So, you know, I started out just thinking, well, I'm a teacher. I might be able to like frame these conversations in some way. And I really just wanted to bring good guests on. And so that's been the goal of this show from the outset, was to find people who are studying things that are really important, that connect to the things that are happening around us today. And mostly from a history perspective, but we've had all sorts of people on the show. But the main thing was just to get these voices out there. And so the show has stayed pretty simple, even though podcasts, I know the podcast world kind of exploded at some point with Serial and a whole bunch of other like leftist podcasts that exploded. But here at Nostalgia Trap, we've wanted to just basically keep it simple, bring on good guests, and really try to package these important viewpoints and perspectives on history for a wider audience. So if we've been successful in that, it hasn't been me. It's been the amazing guests that we've been lucky enough to convince to come on the show over the years. But I do want to mention a couple people and institutions that have been really helpful besides the CUNY Graduate Center and the professors there that really got the show started. Peter Sabatino is one of my best friends for many years, and you've heard him on our vibe checks. He's someone who I sat down with a couple years ago after I'd started the show and asked him if he would come on as producer, because he's such a skilled editor. And he's been instrumental in really bringing the show to another level. He's the one that makes all those great visuals that we put up on Twitter and on our website, nostalgiatrap.com. So thank you, Peter, for really taking the show to a place that I feel very, very proud to show off every week. I tell you all the time that I tell Peter all the time that I'm like, I'm excited every time a new episode comes out, because it feels like we're sharing something that we put together that we really, really want to share and we're proud of. I also want to thank Justin Rogers Cooper, of course. He's been probably our most frequent guest and someone whose episodes are always super popular and always get people talking. Justin is another one of my closest friends, someone who really, to me, represents a lot of what I say when I say that my experience of graduate school really accelerated my thinking. It wasn't necessarily the school; it was, you know, the community of people that I met and engaged with, and Justin is someone who you know, I've never stopped being compelled by the conversations we have. And he's actually, you know, the guest today. We're going to talk about Joker because he finally watched the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, and I had to ask him what he thought about it. So we ended up having a wide-ranging conversation about like the Joker as a historical archetype, and kind of tried to figure out why that archetype has such a particular utility in our age. So enjoy our Joker conversation with Justin today. A few other people that are worth mentioning: Bill Black and KJ Shepard, both of whom are good friends that are on our vibe checks, and have you know, the gossip that we experience in our little tech circle is something that always always brings the show new insights. The conversations that I have with Bill and KJ, both on and off the show, are really, really valuable to me. So thanks, Bill and KJ. And Bill is also, responsible for creating, along with Aaron Bartram, both guests on the show that ended up creating something called Contingent Magazine, which links up with the show. A few other names that are worth mentioning here. Andrew Shustak. Andrew is a fan of the show who started DMing me on Twitter, I think, or emailing me. At some point, we started having a conversation. And Andrew's takes on what's happening, particularly around New York City, have been really, really instrumental in moving a lot of these shows forward. So thank you, Andrew. Yasmin Nair, frequent guest, one of my favorites. She's been just a great supporter of the show, and her episodes are always super popular. So thank you, Yasmin. Max Alvarez. Max has been one of the most tireless promoters of the Nostalgia Trap for years now. We've spoken many times on the phone, and I always am just, and he's been a guest on the show several times, and I'm always just so appreciative of Max's enthusiasm for the show, and I think he really gets what we're trying to do. So thank you, Max, for all the things you've done, both behind the scenes and on social media to promote our show. A couple of left-wing institutions that have been friendly to us. The Baffler Magazine has been great in putting up shows. Jacobin put up some of our shows early on. Chapo Trap House, some of those dudes came on our show early, and really, those guys are huge. And having them as guests, Will and Matt and Felix as guests early on, brought a lot of attention to Nostalgia Trap too. So thank you to Chapo Trap House. I also want to thank my wife, Claudia, who puts up with me closing the door and recording this podcast all the time. She's been a guest on the show, and we hope to have her on again to talk about books and movies and all the pop culture stuff. So she'll be back. Thank you, Claudia, for really making all of this possible in more ways than one. And I do want to thank all of my guests. There are too many to mention, but the guests that have come on the show have really made the show something really, really special. Again, I don't really think of this as a show where I just get on and riff and it's all about what I know or my the things I want to share. I really want to just use my voice as a prop to show off these voices of our guests. So thank you to every guest that has appeared. And again, there's hundreds of them, and you can go back and check out all those episodes. But thank you for appearing on our show. And finally, the listeners and supporters of the show, the patrons of the show that are actually paying for our bonus episodes. I couldn't do this. Honestly, I put a lot of time into this show that I would be putting into probably getting teaching jobs and getting traditional work. But because I have patrons that give me a little bit of money each month, it's been tremendously helpful in allowing me to literally survive an impossible academic job market for a few years now. So the patrons, you guys make it all possible. And I've also just had an insanely cool time, like meeting all the people that signed up for the Patreon and talking with you guys on the platform. Many of the patrons of the show have given me books, guest suggestions, and all sorts of ideas that have made their way into the show. So none of this would be possible without all of the people that contribute. Thank you. I'll stop talking now. I know everyone wants to hear Justin on the Joker, so we'll get to that right now. But again, 200 episodes blows my mind. We're going to do a whole lot more. I'm really excited about Nostalgia Trap moving forward. So thanks again for everyone who listens and supports and makes the show possible. And we will talk to you very soon. Here is me and Justin Rogers Cooper talking about the Joker. All right, Justin. Well, believe it or not, we are now in the process of, right at this moment, recording the 200th episode of Nostalgia Trap. I know you haven't been on all of those, but you've been on quite a few. And I know you're not one for flattery or sentimentality, but you've been a big part of the success of the show. So thank you for joining us again. It's really fun to do the 200th episode with you.
Thank you. I mean, congratulations to you, David. I remember when this was just an idea. You've done an amazing job. Thank God I haven't been on it any more than I have. I am a sentimental person, though.
That's right.
I've learned so much from you and your guests over the years. I'm so happy to have been part of something like this. And, I look forward to continuing to learn from you and everyone who comes on the show for another 200 episodes.
Well, we're gonna try, and yeah, I think you're right to point out just what I tried to do at the beginning was just pick good guests and get people that are out there that are really smart that often aren't the type of voices that are in the larger culture. So if we've succeeded at all in doing that, I'm very happy with it. And the 200th episode is an opportunity to both, I think, reflect on what we've done and look forward to the future. So, one of the things that I think people appreciate about your guest spots that you've done over the years with us, Justin, is our kind of dives into pop culture and kind of trying to figure out and unpack the politics of particular, I don't know, works of art, we might call them, historical documents, you might call them. And we've done Deadwood and Groundhog Day and a bunch of others over the years.
Cobain.
Cobain. We did a Kanye episode at some point, and I think that's back there on the Patreon somewhere. We've done all sorts of stuff, but I thought that it was time we talk about this set of characters. In particular, the character of the Joker from the Batman comic world and the movie world, and really just actually like in the real world now too. Like the Joker character and the clown face has just become like almost like, I mean, an overdetermined cliche within the culture. You see that clown face is on memes of Obama and Trump. And I'm always like, well, wait a second. What does this Joker face mean if it's if Obama's the Joker, Trump is the Joker, all the anarchist protesters are also the Joker? Like it seems like it means something to us. And when I think back at like my life, nostalgia trap way, I'm thinking about, the first Batman in my life that really captured my imagination was the 1989 Batman, the directed by Tim Burton. Michael Keaton plays Batman. Jack Nicholson is the Joker, and that really started off like. In our lifetime, this is what's extraordinary about this. In our lifetime, we've watched the evolution of the Batman and Joker mythology turn into this like some of the most lucrative intellectual property for corporations to make billions of dollars off. It turned into like this cultural phenomenon, and also strangely enough, the role of the Joker turned into this thing that like thespians want to tackle. It's almost like playing Hamlet or Macbeth. You got to play Joker, and it's like, oh, when you hear that some actor has been cast to play Joker, you're like, oh, what are they going to do with the role? Where are they going to take it? And it seems like it's almost like this test of an actor's ability to really go wild and do really fun and really stretch themselves in the role. Everyone wants to play the Joker. So I don't know. I don't know where we start with that, but I know, Justin, you've done some reading on the Joker character and the mythology. I mean, to me, just really quickly, by way of getting us started, one of the things that we've mentioned on this show a couple times, I think, on the Conor Habib episodes, especially thinking about like archetypes and the weird kind of symbology of our age. And when I think about the Joker, I think of like cards, and like the wild card. The Joker is the wild card in a deck of playing cards. And the Joker going back before that would be like tarot cards, the Fool, which is a very kind of different perception of what this character might be. But I remember Daniel Pinchbeck saying that, and I think a lot of people talked about this after the Pinchbeck episode, the last one. He talked about Trump being like this trickster archetype, this sort of like clownish figure. So it all like, I don't know, it all comes together in some way but I think we need to figure it out. And like, I'm wondering what in your readings, like, just to start us off, like, where does this character come from? Like, really, like, obviously there's like the archetypal clown throughout like human history and the archetypal wild card, but the actual Joker character within the Batman universe has a particular history, like stretching back to what, like the 1940s, somewhere in there.
Yeah, actually, I think the first issue of Batman was in 1940. And I think Batman had been in DC Comics, or whatever DC brand was, back in the late 30s. And they were kind of coming up with characters to rival the success of Superman and all this kind of stuff. It's also worth noting that a lot of the whole kind of golden age of comic era came out of like a small group of people who lived in the Bronx. That's just that's a weird trivial thing that I found, but it was like 5 guys that all knew each other, including the person who would become Stan Lee. All these people grew up together in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and they all rose to this kind of success at the same time. But interesting just as a point of comparison to think about the Bronx as one of the birthplaces of graffiti and hip hop, but also as one of the birthplaces of what would become these like global characters. And so Legacies of the Bronx here.
That's incredible. I didn't know that. And it almost like it's like the graphic, colorful, visual style of graffiti and comics coming out of the Bronx. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and it's interesting in part because, I mean, again, this is just an irony and not even a point that I was trying to make, but when you think about the ways that Gotham has been set, you can easily see that the picture of Gotham, how it kind of appeared to some of these artists and writers in the 30s and 40s, the Art Deco period, the Great Depression, and also how in like Burton's film and in a different character, the Phoenix film, the Todd Phillips film.
Yeah.
You have these other very specific Gotham settings. And it's just interesting to think about the residues of the kind of neoliberal Gotham of the Phillips film and the Burton film and the ways that they're presented as these, dark, dirty, crime-ridden places.
Yeah.
And yet that's the stereotype of where people imagine graffiti and hip-hop to be born and to have come out of too. And so there's an interesting historical resonance that, again, isn't my point. So actually,
we'll have to get back to Gotham because it feels like Gotham is actually maybe the integral character in the whole thing. But
yeah, I look forward to hearing what you say about that later because I agree with you. I did find, however, there's a few books on the Joker, and one of them is this crazy book that's actually pretty informative, especially for a casual reader, called The Joker Psychology: Evil Clowns and the Women Who Love Them. And I was like, can this really be a useful book here? And it's edited by Travis Langley, and it is a really useful book. And one of the I won't go into it, but one of the early passages I think captures this moment in time where the Joker comes from. And I'll just briefly read some of it here. And it says, created by artist Jerry Robinson and writer Bill Finger, with influences of a playing card and a German silent film, The Man Who Laughs, starring Conrad Veidt of Casablanca fame, the Joker made his debut in the first issue of Batman Comics in spring 1940, in the same issue that introduced Catwoman to the world. Jerry was becoming wary of the litany of thugs, mobsters, and racketeers faced by the Batman month after month, inspired by the colorful villains featured in the comic strip pages of Chester Gould's Dick Tracy and Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates. Jerry hoped his concept would be a helpful creative contribution to his boss, Bob Kane, as well as Bill Finger. So that's just a little bit of the names of the guys who were and part of this. And the other two things that I would just give back to you here at the beginning is this passage that says, the Joker was named for the classic wild card in a deck of playing cards. He shakes things up and changes the game.
Yes.
He changes his suit, his face, his position in order to tell a new story, the one that's right for the time. Every story needs its source of conflict, and we want every hero to overcome obstacles great enough to earn that name hero, yada, yada, yada. But I thought that was a good passage because it gets at what you're saying about this kind of reimagining of the Joker at successive phases, but it also gets to something, fundamentally true about the Joker, which is that he is a trickster figure, as you just alluded to. There is a shape-shifting quality, and that some people, and maybe we can talk about the presidents as Jokers later, but some people are going to be able to see in the Joker what they want to see. And so that the Joker is both a character with his own proclivities and psychological disturbances and values or lack of values, but he's also, as you just said, he's an archetype. He's something that people also project ideas into, kind of like a Rorschach test. And one other point that I found online about Robinson, one of the creators of the Joker, is that it says he believed that some characters are made up of contradictions And he saw one of those contradictions as the Joker's sense of humor. So that this idea that the one who smiles, the jester, the clown that's also the truth teller, is himself also bound up in contradictions of malevolence and evil potentially. But I also would just say here at the beginning to you that the contradiction of the Joker is also pointing to something that I think, Zizek has talked about, something that we might discuss in more detail later, which is in not every action film, but in many comic book films in the Marvel universe and also in this DC universe and in many other just action films that, Tom Cruise might be in, those kinds of action films, the villains are often given some of the best lines. And so I think it's worth thinking about that even with us importing the evil Joker into a conversation from these comics and from the films in particular, a terrorist, a sadist, at the same time, and especially perhaps in the Phoenix film, there's a couple points to be made about the fact that the villain is sometimes the one telling the truth. And the Batman films kind of direct a lot of ammunition towards, the consequences of that or how to repress that or handle that. But it's also worth thinking about it from our perspective in terms of political economy, in terms of the culture of capitalism, as we do with all of our conversations. And it might be worth spending some time as we get to each of these versions of the character to think about the Joker as a repository, as a location for a kind of repressed truth of capital, which is to say, capitalism and capitalist realism and the sort of common sense of liberal and conservative thinking about the inevitability of capitalism, both as a system, but also as an expression of human nature. To them, the idea that someone would disturb that order, an order that me and you would describe as one of disasters, as an order that produces crime, as an order that makes the Joker.
Yeah.
I think in that context, the Joker for them has to be crazy. He has to be insane. And so it invites not only a question about the common sense of capitalist realism, but it invites a conversation about mental illness and capitalism, a subject that I know you've thought about and that your guests have thought about on this show several times, many times.
That's great.
But also about the logic of insanity. And if you think about it in those terms, weird things start to show up in the Nicholson film and the Ledger film and the Phoenix film, and so on and so forth. So I'll end myself there, but I think that kind of captures something important about the Joker.
Yeah, and so in other words, the Joker ends up being like a way to imagine some other dimension to capitalism and not only that, but some sort of like wild card within it, right? Like some sort of shape-shifting force that might disrupt it in some way. And yeah, always imagining that as crazy. That I'm glad you mentioned those three films, because that's kind of like the trajectory I wanted to follow is, because we're doing the nostalgia trap, this is our lives. I was 10 years old. I was definitely the target audience for the 1989 Batman. And what's interesting is, if you look at these three films, and I know they're kind of some of them are like part of series of films, but just the Tim Burton Batman in 1989 with Jack Nicholson playing the Joker, the ones with the Joker in them, the Dark Knight, which came out in I think 2008 with Heath Ledger as the Joker, and then Joker that came out just last year, 2019, with Joaquin Phoenix playing the Joker. What's kind of incredible about it is that like Batman recedes as the character. You mentioned like, oh, you go for the villain in a lot of these movies. You like want to actually, the villain is the more compelling character, and that seems true here in like the way that like the big Hollywood studios have figured out what people want to see. Is by the time we get to Joaquin Phoenix, Batman's completely gone. It's just Joker. Like it's just that like phantasm. And I think the shape-shifting quality is partly what's important. The fact that big actors that we want to see are playing the Joker are what's important. But it's also just the fact that that's the guy that we want to see. And so in terms of the 1989 version, I just watched that last night, and I've seen it so many times. It was big deal. I mean, I remember being in line, like in a long line in Palm Springs, California, because that's where my parents took us on vacation in the summertime. And we were in line, and this woman that was in front of us in line, she turned around and she said, "Have you seen him yet?" I'll always remember this. And I said, "Seen him yet?" She said, "Yeah, Batman. We saw him 3 times last week, and we're seeing him again now." And the way she like personalized it, like we're seeing him, like I don't know, communicated some importance to me. But also, like, I just got really, really into that movie, probably because it was very poppy and, you know, drew my like 10-year-old imagination in. But I actually collected. They put out like Batman trading cards, like, you know, like baseball cards with the whole story of the movie. And there was actually like a version 1 and a version 2. I collected all of them. I spent all my money on it, and I actually got to the point where this is the point where I was taking my lunch money that my parents were giving me in the morning, and I was going instead to the liquor store near the school, buying candy, filling up my fanny pack. I had a fanny pack with candy, and selling it to the other kids at school, and turning that couple bucks of lunch money into enough money to buy Batman cards. And so I just had hundreds of these Batman cards. Maybe my parents were wondering where I got the cash for these cards, but I was obsessed with it. And you know, I kind of poured over. I had like an album with all the cards like laid out and displayed, and you could like, in other words, I could literally like flip through the story of the film. This is the Tim Burton film, so I'm very familiar with like the imagery, especially from the film, and like the way that they portray Gotham, which is still so memorable to me, and exactly captures what you're talking about, which is this like horrific, like it's kind of the prototypical, you know, nightmare of urban life, you know, and from the very opening of the scene, and Burton uses a lot of special effects and like backdrops and everything to create this like fake Gotham, but everything about it is like dark and grimy and scary, and there are like people you know, reaching out for you and asking you for $1 and like harassing you, and ultimately Batman is a force that comes in and wants to like clean those streets up. But the film, you know, watching it today, you know, Jack Nicholson's performance is nuts, and I think it fits in with like all the other performances that we see of Joker, like subsequently and before, in that he really like stretched himself in the role. Like, he's a total fucking psycho, and it's having like the memory of how dark this character gets with Joaquin and Heath in my mind. I was thinking, oh, if I go back to Jack Nicholson, it's going to be a little cartoonish, a little soft, but actually like he portrays him as just a totally like malevolent evil. And I'm wondering what you think about the film. We're thinking about it coming out in 1989. You know, what is the purpose of you know, it had been a while since Batman was a popular character at that point. I think that this was actually the only Batman thing I encountered before that was like the 60s show with Adam West and Cesar Romero playing Joker. But you know, that was way before my time, and I wasn't really familiar with it. But first of all, what do you remember watching this film as a kid? And the Jack Nicholson character, how does he fit into this larger idea of what the Joker is?
I don't remember it the way that you do, but I do remember seeing it as a kid. This would have been in North Carolina, and I do remember it being an event. I think I remember feeling mostly confusion. It was a little above me. I guess I must have been 8 or 9. 8, I guess, because my birthday was in October, and it must have been a summer film, right?
Yeah, totally.
So I was 8. I definitely did not understand the Vicky Vale character, but I think I was intrigued by her a little. I hadn't watched it in a long time before, you know, rewatching it now. I think one of the things to say about the kind of return of Batman is that in the 50s, there was a moral panic about comic books.
Right.
I think the guy's name is Harvey Wortham, something along those lines. And he believed that adolescents reading comic books was leading to crime and homosexuality. And so these strict codes, you know, came in.
There's a book
and
about that actually called Cycle of Outrage. That's like an academic historian did a book about the panic around juvenile delinquents in the 1950s, and comic books being a big part of that. But also he identifies it as the title of the book suggests, as a cycle of outrage, that in fact people adults tend to have a hysteria about the pop culture that young people are consuming. That sounds very familiar, right? And we've actually seen the cycle of outrage in our own lives about metal music in the 80s, hip hop in the 80s as well. I mean,
that's true.
Yeah. So yeah, comic books definitely have a history of people thinking that they rot your minds, or even worse than that, like turn kids into sadistic little monsters.
So I'm not gonna find exactly what that dude's name was. So forgive me if that wasn't it. But just so you're aware, the comic book era is divided into like an early golden age, a silver age. There's actually a later golden age that overlaps with the silver age. There's a bronze age. There's different parts of the modern age. Like you can tell this is like a very studied subject with people that have a lot of investments in all these different phases. So I don't want to necessarily speak.
If anyone's listening, that's a major comics expert. Yeah. That's not what we're doing here. I'm especially interested in. I'm actually especially interested in how, speaking of comics, how a character like Joker and Batman, how those characters leapt out of the comic book world, in which, especially when you're thinking
totally
prior to the, I know we live in the Marvel age now, but, you and I remember when comics were a much smaller thing, right? And they were much more located within this kind of nerd culture, and almost marginalized and made fun of in some ways to be into comic books. It was even, a character on The Simpsons is a comic book guy, is this like, socially inept,
that's right,
like obnoxious dork that nobody wants to be around. But like Marvel, making
along with Krusty the Clown,
right? Exactly. So like the films that like the Captain America and Iron Man and all that, like, they exploded this stuff and made it turn into something even bigger than any of that. So that's what I'm interested in, is like not so the comic.
Totally.
The comic, I know you can like drill down into the comic stuff and like get lost in it, but what I'm more interested in is kind of like, why did these characters become such so hyper resonant in our lifetime? Beyond the fact that I know there's a kind of top down thing where Hollywood is just cranking these fucking things out. But they are like multi-billion-dollar properties. Lots and lots of people identify with them, and they are the kind of archetypal stories of our age. They're like, these mythological things.
Totally.
But like Joker, I mean, I don't know if I would ever want to do a show about Captain America and Iron Man, stuff like that. I'm not as interested in Joker, and in part it's as I am in Joker, in part because, Joker and Batman captured my imagination as a kid, and I didn't really follow and all the Marvel movies, etc. But also, like, Joker seems to point to, and this is why I think we're doing this, like, Joker in part, like, points to some sort of, like, chaotic anti-capitalist politics in some way, and you really see that as the films progress. Like, the latest Joker film, and people, I think, argue about, how effective the film did this, and that's another conversation. But either way, the Todd Phillips Joker film, like, very self-consciously inserts itself into conversations about, riots and class warfare and, the
neoliberalism,
the politics of a decaying city, and even like very explicitly places itself in like almost like a real New York City of 1983. Like in other words, the story got more real. If you look at the Gotham of Todd Phillips in 2019, it does not look anywhere near as comic-y and cartoonish as the Gotham that Tim Burton creates in 1989.
Totally.
So in other words, that's what I wanted to ask you and what you think about that. Like,
I get it. I didn't mean to derail you either. And
no, not at all.
I mean, the Burton Batman.
Yeah, I think I'm just talking out loud because I want to get us to kind of why am I interested in Joker? It's because that last Joker film in 2019, like, with Joaquin Phoenix, it resonated a lot with a lot of people. And when I say that, I mean, like, at the beginning of my classes, I always do this thing where I ask students to, like, talk about movies and music and get in groups and try to figure out what they think will be remembered in 20 years and things like that. And all of them this semester, like, all they wanted to talk about was Joker. Every group chose Joker, and they were all like, really, like, a typical student would be like, I just think Joker is just like a really important film because it really like covers like important issues about like mental illness and society not caring about people. And it, like, in other words, it really like touched them personally. And so I'm interested in how this, I mean, again, the shapeshifter, right? Because like Joker, if you think about Joker in the Jack Nicholson, I don't think people watch that and was like, oh, now I want to like help outcasts or something. That character is a lot different. He's not you're not as sympathetic to him in that film.
I think that part of what I see going on in the Nicholson one is, first, he's a gangster before he's the Joker. So he's part of organized crime.
Right.
And the Gotham is this bizarre hodgepodge of like 30s Art Deco New York and like 80s Back to the Future inner city dilapidation New York.
Right.
So that like you're getting a weird original laissez-faire image of the Great Depression New York City overlaid by a neoliberal New York City. So you have both periods of like laissez-faire peaking and laissez-faire retrenchment jumbled into one another as an aesthetic for a setting, which is remarkable, and speaks to the entire post-fiscal crisis white flight New York City thing that happened after 68 and up through 75 and on. So when you go back to Nicholson and you also look at him against Tim Burton's like German expressionism type aesthetic that he's kind of famous for, that he weaves into a lot of his films, you're also hooking back into like that 1920s film aesthetic, which is, itself navigating the darkness of the post-World War. It's navigating the rise of fascism across Europe and arguably in the United States. And so you have this Gothic setting, which is also symptomatic and filled with anxieties about politics, the collapse of political orders, the rise of extremism, and also the fact that, in Prohibition, New York City, the gangsters were major political players in addition to being so-called mobsters, or in addition to being mobsters, I should say. So you have a lot of like collisions of genre. There's a lot of genre collision in which you have to kind of unpack what that intersection means, but also, deconstruct it or disaggregate this collision of genres in order to figure out how this recombination is saying something new. And I think that is true for all of the Joker films, for the Batman Joker films. And I think for Nicholson, he kind of talks like a white 80s rich guy before he's turned into the Joker. So at one point, I think he says to his girlfriend or someone else, decent people shouldn't live here. and it's like, oh, this sounds like Trump. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The mayor in the film looks like Koch, the mayor of New York.
Yes, he totally does. I thought it was Ed Koch.
I know. And then you have the DA in the film. I'm blanking on his name.
Harvey Dent.
Harvey Dent is played by an actor,
Billy D. Williams.
Billy D. Williams, yeah. And I thought he was kind of capturing a kind of black politician stereotype of that era that I associated with Dinkins, who was mayor at the time the film was released, I think.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say that Harvey Dent in 1989 Batman seems like Dinkins, yeah. And so they're all, so this is the neoliberalism you're talking about, the kind of like this government that's portrayed as kind of bumbling or corrupt.
And also, I mean, this it's very stark in the Nicholson Burton film, but it's just a world of men, and it's 99% white as far as the ruling class. Like all of those films are about white ruling class men and how they psychologically and politically manage a urban population that is extraordinarily unequal, extremely dangerous, and can't be trusted. And it's like a corporate management lesson. And it's also like, as we both alluded to earlier, it's like a corporate management film in which the enemy is always like evil, with the exception of the Phillips film, is always just like an archetypal evil, in that if only there wasn't the Joker, things would be ripe for accumulation and we wouldn't have any problems.
Right.
And so the question of cause and effect is central to the Joker's identity in all of the films. And so in the Nicholson film, what's worth remembering here is that because each of these narratives cannot say, well, again, with the exception of the Phillips, none of the narratives, though, are able to say the criminal is produced by an unequal society. That the criminal is a product of someone who makes a logical decision to the world that Batman's trying to save. You know, in other words, you know, capitalism is what produces crime, not evil. But because the films can't really say that, what we get is a funhouse mirror version of it, so that what happens with the production of the Joker here is that, remember, Nicholson is only in that chemical factory because he's betrayed by this like larger mob boss who's mad at him for having an affair with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
So they're like sharing a woman, and Nicholson doesn't think it's a big deal. He's very mad when he confronts the mob boss about it. But it's then in the chemical plant, Axis Chemicals, where there's like this exchange between him and Batman, who like drops him in the vat of chemicals, from which he emerges as the evil freak clown that he is. But even at the end, when Batman, Michael Keaton, has his revelation, his nostalgia memory, when he's thinking like, wait a minute, where have I seen this smiling devil before? What you learn is that isn't he the one? Have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight?
Yeah,
he's the one that kills the Waynes, the parents. And so this question that he says to Batman, I believe towards the end, which recalls the chemical vat and the initial murder, is he says, "You made me," and
yeah.
to which he replies like sarcastically, "I made you. You made me first." And without getting into like the logical fallacies and the absurdities of the tautology there, what I think that does is it goes back to the idea that not only are we dealing with a Joker that's a site of contradiction, many sides to this guy, someone who's expressing more than one thing at the same time, but you're also getting into this bizarre but central, primary, dialectical relationship between the Joker and the Batman, which is to say, even if you follow the narrative, when the Joker says, "You made me," it just depends on how far you go back. Yeah, he dropped you in the chemical vat, but that the mob boss was the reason you were there in the first place.
Right.
You know, the whole thing was a setup. And so the origin story itself is very muddy. And I think the muddiness of the origin story points to a continuing problem between the Joker and the Batman that this film does quite well, which is, why does the Joker exist? And what's really interesting is, even if you think the Joker's muddy memory of where he came from is itself revisable, at the same time, Batman concretely did drop him into the chemical vat. So whether intentional or accidental, Batman, the person who's supposed to save the city from crime, is the person who creates the worst criminal. And I think that what that gets into in terms, and this comes up in this book I was referring to earlier in many different ways, but how they're mirror images of each other, and it captures this dialectical relationship between capitalism and terrorism. That, you know, a capitalist order cannot help but produce enemies. there will always be an enemy production. In fact, capitalism as an economy is an enemy production machine because it continually produces antisociality and disaster. And antisociality and disaster create people who are antisocial and are themselves terrorists. And so that you cannot ever arrest your way out of capitalism or crime. You can't. There simply isn't a police force large enough to incarcerate not only the so-called criminals, but all the potential criminals out there, to which, the second film, the Ledger film, is a little bit more interested in.
But also,
coming at that post 9/11 moment. But that's a long way to say, when we get into the problem of did Batman make the Joker, or is Batman what sustains the Joker? When we hear Ledger in the second film say, I'm a dog chasing a car, I don't even know what I'd do if I caught it. This idea that the Joker needs Batman.
Yeah.
But it points us to this idea that Batman needs the Joker. And that tension between these archetypal characters, I think, I'm not the first one to say this, of course, but for now, I would say that what that makes me think is that it's standing in for a larger problem about the inherent relationship between capitalism and crime.
Yeah, no, and that Heath Ledger moment, I think, doesn't he like literally reference Jerry Maguire, like Heath Ledger Joker at some point says to Batman, I think he does. Like, you complete me. Like he says, yeah, he does. Like we're two halves. I like
your voice, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. We're two halves at the same point. It's funny how the Batman voices and all the voices actually like modulating the voice seems to be a common thing. Like Heath Ledger's character. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the YouTube video of Tom Waits, like on a TV show in 1970s, and many people say that Heath Ledger watched this clip of Tom Waits and kind of did an impression of him, because like he has this very particular way of talking that like the Heath Ledger performance is pretty nuts. But I think that the point you're getting there about the Batman and Joker sort of generating each other is great, and not only that. I think you're right. It's like the films end up, especially the 1989 ones, and maybe it's a progression, is that we're getting like towards more and more away from the idea that these individuals generate each other, and they're tied up in maybe a larger system that's generating the whole thing, which seems like the Todd Phillips film is kind of taking us to that place a little bit more, where they're saying like actually like they even changed the way the Wayne characters are perceived and everything else. But I kind of want to talk about right now, like in terms of like generating violence in a society and that sort of thing, about the Batman character himself. Like he we've talked about how the idea that, I don't know, people really want to see the Joker, people really want to see the villains. Like, in other words, every time you heard about the succession of the new Batman film, you'd be like, oh, who are they going to do? They already did the Joker, so who are they going to do? It's like, oh, the second one has Catwoman and the Penguin. And the third one has Riddler, the Riddler and Mr. Freeze, and all these different like really great characters. But the Joker seems to be like the big daddy, like in more ways than one. That the Joker seems like the one that compels us the most. And I'm wondering about that, because it's like, who are the heroes of these films? Because Batman ostensibly is the hero of these films, right? Batman is supposed to be the guy that when I was a kid, you want to dress up like Batman, right? Like there were tons of kids on the streets on that Halloween dressed up like Batman. They weren't dressed up like Joker, although maybe there were a few. But I feel like now like Halloween, there were tons of Jokers, like tons and tons and tons of Jokers. So I'm interested in that process, and also like, okay, if Batman's the hero, Batman, what is he? Because he's pretty much a vigilante. And you and I have texted about this, the kind of like connection to law enforcement that Batman represents. He's like basically a cop, like a form of private cop. And the type of policing he's doing is like broken windows policing. He's not going after structures. He's not going in like he's not breaking up Wall Street. He's instead like going after people who are pickpockets and thieves and like street criminals, which is like, dude, come on, Batman. That style of policing is old school and racist. We're supposed to know that. And yet Batman represents this kind of like teched out cop guy who like is proving to the inept police and the inept politicians of the city that this is the way you address crime. And you address it by, I don't know, it's kind of silly, but dressing up like a bat and scaring the shit out of street criminals with all sorts of like weaponry. You've pointed out like Batman's big thing is like justice. He doesn't kill people. He wants to beat him, rough him up and handcuff him, I guess. But either way, you know, it's interesting to think about that in light of the fact that Batman kind of recedes as a character that people are interested in as much as the Joker character, who seems to represent a threat to that order. And you know, by the time we get to the Christian Bale depiction of Batman, it's really boring. Like I don't know if other people felt that way, but Bale's performance is kind of muted. And he's just kind of like, I mean, Christian Bale could do anything, right? Like, we know he could have played the Joker. Like, Christian Bale, we know, is an actor who's like wild. He could do anything, but instead he's like this muted figure of blank authority who's kind of haunted by his parents' death. And it ends up being like, well, shit, man, show me the Joker, because this Batman guy is a total bore. I wonder what you make of that, because and about Batman as like a figure of like authority. So it almost seems like our interest in the Joker is, it might like, I don't know, might correlate to an interest in seeing that sort of authority threatened or shaken up in some way. We like it when that sort of stuff is kind of played with in a colorful way by some colorful character like Joker.
I think that's, you know, a whole lot of great points. And, I think the main thing to point to there is, you're right that, like, you know, Batman is a broken windows police officer. And yet, until he meets the Joker, he's approaching broken windows policing with like full on techno riot gear. So it's like it'd be like if the NYPD wanted to stop mugging with RoboCop. Like, RoboCop wasn't sent after like a bad crew. RoboCop was just out there like beating the crap out of people during stop and frisk.
That's a great example. RoboCop is totally within that 80s thing. And I want to point out, RoboCop is a fucking brilliant film because it's a satire. It's literally like, if you watch it, it's like a hilarious satire of the notion of like this mega cop who's like super tricked out violently. Brilliant film. That Batman, I feel like the 1989 Batman, even they don't really play with that level of satire. They're more like taking it seriously that Batman is this figure of authority, if that makes sense. They never, like, Batman's ripe for satire. You could totally fuck with Batman. And yet Batman's just like dead serious character in all these things. I mean, we've mentioned he's like a Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, like a, you know, this billionaire dude who's using his money to like play out in part some sort of Freudian fantasy because it's all about his parents dying, and he connects like all street crime to his parents' deaths. So like Batman's like a kind of a total freak, and it makes me think that the Joker's right when he's like, you complete me, because we're like, they're both like completely nuts.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, the Christian Bale trilogy really gets at this. But all three films, or I guess those two films, because he's not in that third one, I keep forgetting that. Both of those films, you know, Batman is a friend to the police commissioner. He's a friend to the DA. And he's a friend to the ruling class of the city. He himself is a billionaire, and he's there to help police inequality for other billionaires. And I think that part of what you're pointing to is, like, in all of those films, the masses are depicted as idiotic and incapable of ruling themselves. Both of those films are profoundly anti-democratic. Yes. And there's a mistrust.
We're talking about the Christopher Nolan films specifically, right? That's what
but also, you know, one thing that I think is very important about the Nicholson film is towards the end. One of the big scenes is that Nicholson's Joker starts tossing money away to the crowds, which leads to some of the epic climax of the film.
Yep.
And he has already told Vicky Vale that he's not a killer, he's an artist, which I think is a really key line for understanding the Joker in those first two films in particular, but also I think is still relevant to the Phoenix film.
For sure, yeah.
And as he's giving away this money, the crowds of people just don't care about anything. They're just rushing towards the money, and you hear someone say, like, this is Gotham's greed. That he's using the greed of average people against themselves. And in that moment, they all love the Joker, who's like sitting on this chair, and he's the hero. He's giving away the money. Now, remember, this is 1989. He's giving away free money. He now embodies socialism. He's the socialist figure, but he's actually evil. And that's the Cold War spin on Nicholson's Joker.
He's saying, money, money. Who do you trust? Who do you love? Money, money, money. Who do you trust? Who do you love?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a conservative would be saying about liberals. Like, they're creating dependency on the state. They love money and they hate work. Like, that's the Joker's joke at that moment. And in that moment, we have an embodiment of socialism as terrorism, because in the next sequence, he's gassing the very people that he gave all this money to, and I think that's
why is he gas them in the film? I mean, I don't really remember. Is he just pure sadism that he gasses them?
Well, number one, he's a deep misogynist in the film who poisons makeup so that men who wear makeup, like that newscaster on the show,
right, yeah.
but also the models and the female anchor and women everywhere will become disfigured just like him. He's a really hardcore misogynist, and he wants to abuse and kill women as a form of excitement and pleasure and terrorism. So that at the one of his motives, and that the whole film, one of the whole motives is this homosocial rivalry over who gets to traffic women's bodies and what you can do to women's bodies. I mean, it's that, to me, actually looking back, was by far the most terrifying aspect of the film. And part of his desire is to disfigure and maim Vicky Vale, who, of all people in the film, is a journalist, a photojournalist who specializes in photographing war crimes that are happening in other countries. So that there are flash images of black and white photos in that movie, which is her work that Joker's looking at. And he says to her that they're both artists because she's photographing dead bodies in war zones, civilians, women and children who have been killed. And what is she supposed to, where was she supposed to have been? Central America? This is before Yugoslavia. So, I mean, what were the civilian casualties going on at that time? Joker compares her desire to show the world the dark truths around, the killing machines of genocide. He compares that to what he wants to do, which is to gas Gotham. His ultimate desire it's a Ledger's idea that he's going to blow up one of those boats of people, of the prisoners and the civilians,
right.
At the end of the film. It's a version of that. That's a mutation off of this, which is some part of the Joker isn't just invested in the petty crime that Batman loves to police. The Joker in these two films is an agent essentially of mass killing, of mass death. He is someone who is willing to terminate whole populations. And it's the magnitude of his evil desires that in at least in the films necessitates Batman, because it's almost as if the ruling class and the police can only manage small crime. But when it comes to existential threats, city-sized threats, and this feeds into the post 9/11 era of the Bale films. But when it comes to these existential threats, you need agents and agencies that are beyond the law. And so Batman's rogue status is akin to CIA.
Yeah.
It's akin to unaccountable law enforcement. It's akin to secret agencies that must be hidden. And in that sense, Batman anticipates the Cold War. He comes up at 1940, which is, I mean, the OSS is just getting started in the 1940s at that moment.
Yeah.
So Batman comes of age before the CIA, but he becomes a popular figure in the idea when the U.S. national security state is born in 1945 and so forth. And he fully embodies this post-World War II United States national security state that spans the Cold War to the War on Terror, the 9/11 moment. He embodies this idea that not only does the United States need secret agents and agencies who are there to protect order, but that it embodies the idea that in a democracy, you are not actually allowed to know who is doing what. And you just have to have this blind trust, blind faith, blind allegiance in the people in power and in these like supernatural, archetypal, renegade, rogue agents. You just have to trust that they're doing the right thing. And that's it. That's the end of the story. And that desire for such an allegiance, which is what Batman really embodies, is a fascist desire. It is literally the people in power saying, we're corrupt, but we beat the alternative.
Yeah.
And we're going to beat back any attempt to sabotage our order. We're going to beat it back with a kind of violence that won't see the light of day, in which you can never contain or control. What a bizarre fantasy for a hero.
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, what the fuck is Christopher Nolan up to? Because in 2008, when Dark Knight came out, you know, a lot of people were pointing this out, and they were saying, like, this is like, you know, this is the tail end of the 8 years of George W. Bush, in which we've seen, like, basically George W. Bush administration standing up for the style of leadership and fighting crime, or under the guise of the War on Terror, as Batman, as depicted by Christian Bale in this film, which is that he's this, you know, you really see it much more in the Nolan films, that this Batman as CIA figure, like a military contractor. I mean, they make it explicit that, like, Morgan Freeman's character is connected to military contractors and can get him all this tech. They also, like, there's a big long bit in Dark Knight about surveillance and how Batman is going to surveil every citizen in Gotham in order to solve crime. And, you know, them like even discussing, well, this is undemocratic, but they say you got to do what you got to do. And even the end of the film, where that Batman and Commissioner Gordon basically conspire to tell a lie, and to tell a lie about what happened, and actually make Batman take the fall for it, so that they can hold up Harvey Dent as a figure of moral purity and political leadership, and really tell the public this lie. So, like, you know, I know that's like the Zizek clip, in which Zizek really, like, lays out why that's just a terrifying thing that this film is portraying, because it's basically saying that, like, but I wonder, like, because, you know, you talk about riots and crowds and, like, you know, the masses, and it seems like the masses are often a character in these Batman films, right? Like, the Gotham is one thing, but then there's the people, and it's often a very condescending view of the masses. The masses are just these kind of, like, dumb things that have to be controlled, and the Joker character seems to have a more realistic view of that than like, in other words, they show. And I wonder what you make of this scene. You know, it's probably one of the most famous scenes in the whole Nolan trilogy, is the interrogation scene between Batman and Joker, in which Batman is, like, beating Joker, and where are they? Where are they? And Joker's just laughing in his face. And that's a Bush administration thing they're doing, right? He actually locks the door. Like, Batman locks the door, and they're making it very clear that what Batman is about to do is a violation of civil rights, right? Like, what Batman is about. And Commissioner Gordon has set this up. Like, Commissioner Gordon actually wants to employ Batman in this torture way. He wants him to torture Joker physically in order to get, you know, the information out of him. And what does Joker do? He just, like, laughs in his face and says, like, you have nothing to do with all of your strength. And he actually, in that moment, and I don't know if you would read it the same way, in this shape-shifting moment, Joker represents almost just like the the idea that none of this stuff works, and that there's a chaos that you can't control, and that all of your torture and your surveillance and all of your different like apparatus of the state that you want to use to control these masses doesn't really account for the wild card like the Joker, right? Doesn't really account for something that can't be controlled, which is some sort of, I guess, sadistic impulse or some sort of like, wild violence that he's trying to tell Batman through his laughter. Like through his laughter and smile, he's trying to tell Batman, like, it's never going to happen, dude. You're never going to control these masses. That seems like a really, I don't know, it's like a conflicted message within these films for sure.
I think that what you point out, is that idea that weakness is what's within the law, and you have to break the law. At one point, I think Dent or the Commissioner Gordon says to him, "You've got rules, he's got no rules. Like, that's your problem, is that you've got these rules in place." And I think that part of what else is playing into that is the idea that what you're saying, that the Joker embodies something natural, that he's the unaccountable evil that you have to break all the rules for, because that's the only way to stop someone. And this is said throughout the film, such as some men just want to watch the world burn. And another point, I'm not a monster, I'm just ahead of the curve, which I guess is a slightly different point. But it's this idea that the world's going to burn, everything burns if you don't throw everything out the window and annihilate your own morality. And that part of why we're supposed to sympathize with Batman is that he's the one who has to destroy his own morality to save the rest of us, because that's the only way to confront the evil. Now,
that's
part
so
of what I
want to. Holy shit!
Which is, I think. Okay, I'll stop there because there's things you can say about that.
I don't want to interrupt you, but that's a great point. That he, like, poor Batman, he has to destroy his morality because it's such a point that he doesn't kill, right? And like at the end of the Heath Ledger, I think he says Heath Ledger says to Batman, he's like making fun of him for having rules. He's like, you have all these rules, but they don't work. And then he says something like, well, tonight you're gonna break your one rule. So in other words, Joker wants to make Batman kill. In order to like prove some point to him.
Well, and Joker is ironic in that film because he has a bunch of fucking rules too. Yeah. And some of his rules are, sadistic, like setting the criminals against one another. Like, funny, he gave me the same message, and then the guy shoots his other friend when they're robbing the bank in the middle.
That's right, yeah.
The disposability. But, that last scene with the Joker, where the Joker is so invested in proving that people are evil, and that part of if you can call it a moral center, the only moral center that I saw in that Dark Knight film was the moment when the kind of like angry white dad goes to the button that's going to sink the other boat full of criminals.
Yes.
And then like the scary tall African-American black prisoner walks up and grabs the same remote from like the prison warden, who's like just hands it over like, oh my God, like this guy, this guy's going to make the choice that I can't make. And it's all about like, who makes the choice to destroy themselves inside? Like, in other words, my survival is more important than your survival, which is one of the key things running through the whole film. As far as the Joker is concerned, he's really determined to, he likes to laugh. He thinks it's funny, like in a dark way, when people are forced to make a choice of sacrificing another while they themselves live. It's like some sort of biopolitical power relationship that he wants activated across the societal chain. And what happens in this moral center of the film is that neither of the men press the button. That's and right. Then, Batman says to him, see, they're not as evil as you thought. And, and at that moment, Heath Ledger's Joker, I believe, is like trying to work through what this means in his mind. The point that I'm making is he just set up a game with rules.
Yeah.
It's a macabre game. Now, I think the other thing that I would say that winds all this back, however, is that Heath Ledger's Joker can't get his origin story right. Where'd he get that smile? Where'd he get that face? He tells a different story to everybody. which leaves this gap. It's an aporia. It's this absence in the center of his origin, which is to say, where did he come from? And I think that goes back to what you just said. Heath Ledger's Joker actually probably isn't an unnatural, unstoppable evil that is just some sort of like interiorized freak of nature. By pointing to the nebulous origins of where he even comes from, it really, I think, points to the idea that the Joker, as always, is a product of the culture in which he came up out of.
Yeah.
There's a reason why there's more serial killers and mass shootings in the United States than any other country, and it's not just to do with the availability of guns. The United States produces a certain kind of homicidal man that just other countries. Yeah, we produce Jokers, exactly.
And they're usually white males, and
right.
And that's something that's interesting to me too. Is that and maybe this can get us to the Phoenix, because the Joaquin Phoenix film is one that again removes Batman from the story, and gets us to a point where we're thinking about the origins of this character in a much more specific way, right? The Ledger character is this sort of illegible origin story, but with Joker in the Joaquin Phoenix, we get this. It's becoming much more specific and like much more specific to like connecting to like real politics in some way. Like I only saw Dark Knight Rises, which doesn't have Joker in it, once, the one with Bane, which has like Occupy Wall Street in it, and kind of a muddled again, the masses that are to be feared in some way. But the Joaquin takes the Joker character to a different place. It feels like a different version than we've seen before, and one that I think is again seems more resonant than all of the others in some way, in terms of like the young people love this film. This film made a lot of money. It was huge, but also divided critics. I think audiences liked it more than critics, but who gives a fuck with? But either way. Mm-hmm. What how did the Todd Phillips Joker film, like how does it change our view of all this stuff? Because again, like Batman's gone, so we don't have this like idea of Batman as the generative thing of the Joker, although the Wayne family seems to be pretty present in the story. I don't know. The Joker, the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, is a film that it's weird to me because it's choosing right at this moment in 2019 to go back to early 80s New York City. And I wonder what that's all about.
The thing that I see in the transition from the Ledger to the Phoenix Joker is, I believe Ledger says this to Batman. He says, madness is like gravity. All it takes is a little push. And I think that helps to explain the Phoenix Joker a lot. And I think the way that I would revise that statement is to say, madness is like gravity. All it takes is a little capitalism. All it takes is a little neoliberalism. All it takes is a little, so, part of what makes the Phoenix character exceptional is that there is a Freudian narrative. It's disfigured Freudianism. But it wants to say, this is how you produce a Joker. It's a combination of someone who's been betrayed by their family, someone that already has probably something that's wrong with them on the inside, that's activated by that betrayal or exacerbated by that betrayal. That there is neurodiversity, there is divergence, there is not one human mind. And when, on the great spectrum of human brains that are possible, which are, the human brain will just genetically evolve to become something new every time. And we know that there are certain kinds of characters and certain kinds of traits. And to some degree, some mental illness is inherited. And to another degree, some mental illness is activated. And some mental illness isn't really activated or inherited, but people can be traumatized socially or personally into mental illness. There's many origins for it. Part of what the Joker tells us is the dude is definitely, I think, a neurodivergent guy. By that, I don't mean autistic.
Yeah.
I don't mean mentally disabled. I just mean that I get the sense that he would have been thinking differently if he had been raised in a warm family environment.
That's the shapeshifter element of him. He's
right.
a kind of guy, and we know this. There are people, and I think we see it a lot actually in fiction, where you see this character that could go either way. You know what I mean? And and in fact, it's said. I just watched the last scene of Joker. Spoiler alert! I think everyone who's listening to this has probably seen it, or at least knows what happens at the end. But in that final, just before he shoots the Robert De Niro character, he says, you know how you get a guy like me, you know how you get like a Joker is you take a mentally ill loner and you put him in a society that treats him like trash and doesn't care about him. And it's like they don't really hide what they're saying here. It's very much meant to be like this version of the Joker is a character that has been abused. Like he's a product of abuse, and that's something that is sort of new in the Joker film. Like he's not when you first meet Joaquin Phoenix's character in the film, he is not a criminal gangster like the Jack Nicholson. I mean, he's as far from that as could be. You see him like basically working a degrading job in a degrading environment, and like getting the shit kicked out of him by street kids.
And he's actually trying, like, what's kind of pathetic is that he's trying to be like a successful clown. Like he wants to be a performer, and he's continually abused as an adult. He's abused by the kids. He's abused by those Wall Street strangers. He's abused by his boss. He's abused by the police. He's abused at every turn. And so he's backed into a corner. And throughout the film, he meditates on suicide as an option. And in fact, when he first fantasizes about the Murray Franklin show, he's imagining it as an on-air suicide, not necessarily a murder. In a weird way, he arguably, it's hard to tell what reality is in that film and what's real and everything else, but he arguably doesn't make the decision to murder Murray Franklin until he's on the set. Because even, I believe, in the dressing room, he's thinking about suicide, not murder.
Right. Right.
And that's why he reads those lines from his journal. I hope my death makes more sense than my life.
Right.
With sense spelled CENTS. And I think that's one of my favorite lines in the film. I think that's very loaded.
Yeah.
And that really gets at the imbrication of capitalism and mental illness that the film wants to make. And I think you're right. It kind of, it hits the nail on the head, but I think that the Joker himself, Phoenix, he's not obviously also the best spokesperson for where he comes from. I think he's able to capture some of the truths of how he got to be the way he was. But remember, he doesn't even remember, because he's repressed it, his childhood trauma and abuse. He has to discover that in the file at, I believe, the Arkham Mental Hospital.
That's right.
From the attendant. He steals his own history, which is his mother's psychological file. He steals that from the attendant. And so the film actually shows a more complicated origin story than he himself articulates.
Sure.
And the film also is invested in showing us that the kind of rioting, protest, uprising response, which is extremely class-based and also raises questions about masculinity. It invites us to think that the Joker is also part of a political project that he himself doesn't necessarily understand. And I think that's, at least throughout the whole film, or through most of the film, and that's the point that I believe Leslie Lee is making in that Truth Out article that you sent me.
That's right, yeah.
Where he's actually saying, just that. He actually writes, Arthur Fleck declares he is not political, and then Leslie Lee writes, it's impossible to view the film as anything other than a condemnation of austerity and immiseration, ushered in by corporations like Wayne Enterprises with the aid of politicians like Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Super good line. I thought Leslie's, or Mr. Lee, I don't know him, I thought his response here was very appropriate, but also points to this idea that Joker is more than what happens to him. It's more than what he narrates. And the film is toggling back and forth between this relationship between personal identity, family history, class conflict, culture, but also like all the films.
And embodying
all
Gotham.
of the films are about toxic masculinity as well. That it's a word we haven't gotten to, but these films are, again, they're about white men. They're about whiteness and masculinity. Almost end of discussion. That is, and if they're perverse, and if both the Joker and the Batman are flawed figures, well, that is part of the checkmate of white masculinity in the era that the films are spanning. And it's some of the baggage of the Phoenix film. Like, this is a film that I think has some really good points to make. Some of the baggage is that the film is transparent about its relationship to austerity and class and capitalism in a way that I find interesting and novel. The film is also, at the level of symbolism, pretty anti-capitalist in a way that I find remarkable, and shows the generation of a protest movement that, however oversimplified, the images of the rioting at the end, in which the Joker isn't the author, but the invited guest, the idea that other people are controlling this revolt against police and ruling class authority. For all of that, the film is not transparent and is not necessarily as self-conscious about the role of race and masculinity for everything else that it's doing. And I think because those things are left off to the side, it makes me wonder about the future of the Joker. I want to think about Joker and racialization, Jokers from different racial, ethnic, national backgrounds. I also want to think about how the Joker is a global figure during this moment too, that it's gone from 1989 to 2019. It's gone in those, 30 years?
Yeah. It's
gone from a kind of U.S. archetypal Great Depression figure into a figure of global knowledge, consumption, production, etc. But also, again, getting back to this question of the future, what would a Joker that is a woman of color mean? Is that the next real Joker? If this trajectory continues the way that you've narrated and Batman drops out, and we're actually looking at the true conflict in all the Batman comics was never between Batman and crime. It was between the Joker and the Wayne Corporation. If that's true, if the true conflict is between the Joker and the Wayne Corporation, if Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas Wayne, is the actual personification of disorder and the origin of crime, and necessitates a revolt, what does Gotham look like when we take it back to who was really the political, cultural, and social actors in the Bronx in 1981, 82, 83, which would have been black artists and musicians? Why can't we have that Gotham? Why is the Gotham always the way that it is now? And what would it take to truly bring this story out of its own nostalgia trap and into the 2020s, into our era of Black Lives Matter protests? And I'm very curious about that, because it echoes the social media conversations that are going on right now about who should be leading resistance to authority at this moment, and what are people's roles. And in that sense, now that Batman has dropped out, what is the future of the Joker?
Yeah, those are great thoughts. And it made me think about the racial elements of the Joaquin Phoenix film, which I thought were a little bizarre because they were very contradictory. I mean, on the one hand, there were a lot of black characters that were seeming to represent the like social worker class who were there,
Yes.
oftentimes serving as barriers to Joaquin Phoenix's character, Arthur Fleck, getting help. And many of the and there's one woman who even says that like the system doesn't care about people like you and it doesn't care about people like me, you know. And so there's like this like weird like chance for some sort of racial solidarity against the forces of oppression there, which I thought is really interesting. But at the same time, there's this bizarre shit that happens with race in the film where you have like it's taking place in a recognizable New York City, 1983. It's explicitly identified as such, and it actually two of the most important instances in the film are direct references to racialized events. The first one being the beating that the kids put on him at the beginning, I think is in reference to Central Park 5, which is kind of interesting because the black kids were actually the victims of the Central Park 5. And in here, Todd Phillips is serving to like actually just reconstitute the image of savage young people of color beating people on the street for no reason, which is really interesting for him to repeat that lie in the film. But also they redo the subway shooting is very clearly meant to be the Bernie Getz incident, which is again in reality, Bernie Getz shot black men and killed them on the subway and went to prison for it. But they reverse it and they make it a white man the victim of the Bernie Getz shooting, which was interesting too because the white men who are the victims in the Joaquin Phoenix film end up being bad guys because they're like Wall Street, like they're like Wolf of Wall Street types, you know, and their killing actually electrifies the masses. But I just thought that was weird to like invoke these like really well-known events in the history of New York City, at the same time kind of draining them of their kind of racialization and just using them as kind of the props for, you know, the story of Arthur Fleck's degradation. And that makes me think about your question, which is the Joker maybe like stuck as a white male character? Like, is it in fact important that the Joker be a white man because he's representing this particular kind of sadistic serial killer mass shooter type? Would it be wrong, or would it be like historically inaccurate, whatever? Would it not work to like change the race and gender of this character because he kind of represents like concentrated misogyny and sadism, and so the question is like, you may be aware that there was a film on Netflix called Into the Spider-Verse in which they took the Spider-Man character and like made the Spider-Man character like they made it so like almost like Black Lives Matter. You could just be a part of Spider-Man if you say you are. And it's like and so in other words, they made this opportunity for the Spider-Man story to be about young black girls and like Hispanic boys and like, you know, like and just like really it's a very woke Spider-Man, in other words.
Yeah.
And I wonder like, is there a woker? Is there a woke Joker? Is it possible to do that, or is the kind of joke, the point of the Joker character is in part that these are like white dudes? I don't know the answer to that.
I think that's a great question, and you know it drains whatever lingering romanticism I had left about the Joker. But what it really means is that what these stories are is that these are stories of racial and class pathology. That the Joker isn't necessarily a figure of rebellion. He could be associated with this rebellion in the film, but he's actually trapped in a kind of white pathological response to power. And so is Batman, you know, obviously, I guess, for that matter.
Yeah.
And what it
They need each other.
I guess what I guess it points to something. I think to me the moment at the end of the film gets at what you're saying, which is the movie's like kind of latent racism. Or I'm not sure, racial violence is at the end when presumably he's in Arkham Hospital after he's been rearrested. In the closing scenes, he's back with an African-American woman, social worker type person who's, you know, again, asking him questions, and he's like smiling to himself. And she's like, you know, kind of trying to get at, what are you smiling for? And he's like, I'm thinking of a joke. You wouldn't get it. And Sinatra's playing in the background, and it's those lines, some people get their kids stomping on a dream. It's that song, That's Life by Sinatra that plays throughout the whole film. Well, he's sitting there kind of, I think he's smoking and he's cuffed and smiling to himself. And then the film cuts to him walking down the hallway and he leaves behind a trail of bloody footprints. And that ambiguity of like, wait, is this happening right after that scene? Because if it is, did he just kill that African-American woman that was asking him those questions?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And if that's that moment, then to me, that's when he is actually emptied of whatever partial moral authority the film has locked into that character. The film isn't saying you can damage people so much that they'll pick and choose their victims, but they're still going to have a conscience. I mean, throughout the film, his choice of murders reveals someone that is making decisions about who lives and who dies,
right,
and according to some sort of moral code that still exists. If he's killing that woman at the end of the film, to me, he becomes the Jack Nicholson character. It's an act of racism and misogyny that, there's just no justification for it.
It's weird. And it doesn't, And it doesn't.
He's truly become that.
Yeah, and it doesn't connect to the class politics anymore. It's just and maybe that's the point. I think that's partly why the Joker film is a little muddled in terms of what it's trying to say. It's like it's really like throwing a lot at the screen, and part of it is like okay, but if I can read it through what we've been doing with the Joker here, it's like maybe that what Joaquin Phoenix's character is supposed to represent is again like a character who was on the edge, teetering on the edge, and a society that didn't care kind of pushed him into this position where he's now sort of like a chaotic murderer. In other words, in other words, he's saying you've pushed me to the point where there will be no logic to the violence that comes out of me. You won't be able to direct it anymore. It won't be like aimed at anything. It's in other words, the film ends up being not so much about politics, but about like the psychology of the mass shooter, the psychology of the person that just wants to kill, and the killing itself becomes the political act, I guess, or the end of it. And maybe it is drained, but yeah, I think the Joker film, the Joaquin Phoenix, Todd Phillips, whatever, it electrified the country in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of people really reacted to this film one way or the other, and I think that people will be thinking about it for a while. And I do wonder, like, what the future of the Joker character is, because they kind of took it to its logical end here, and yet they're always rebooting it. And I think it's worth thinking about, like, why do we need this character? Why does the Joker continue to pop up? And not only that, when you look at memes and like stuff around protests and Trump and Obama, like we started out talking about, like the Joker iconography seems to represent like basically anything you want it to represent, but some sort of like always some sort of notion that there's a truth underneath the truth, that there's like some sort of like it's ironic because the Joker makeup is makeup, right? It's a mask. And I love that you mentioned Tom Cruise, because Yasmin Nair and I had a discussion about Tom Cruise a couple weeks ago. And, one of the things we talked about is that smile, like that Tom Cruise, like Joker smile is pretty nuts. Like, and that smile seems to be, something we've mentioned before, the smile as the kind of ubiquitous symbol of American corporations, and even like other countries, other cultures will look at Americans and be like, why do Americans smile so much? Like, what's with that like big grin? Like, what is with our fucking grin? Like our grin, the grin of the Amazon has a smile as its symbol. McDonald's has a grinning clown. Walmart is a smiley face. You mentioned Nirvana actually played with the smiley face. So it seems like there's something going on with the smiling Joker mask. And I know we've gone over time here, but even like I'm thinking of even like V for Vendetta. I want to make sure I mention that because I know people will be saying you didn't mention V for Vendetta, but like there's another example of like the smiling face from a comic book that seems to represent some sort of like anti-capitalist or maybe like intervention, some joke at the center of everything, showing up at protests. I mean, that Guy Fawkes mask became the symbol of Anonymous, which is some sort of like anarchic collective. I'm not sure if I'm describing what Anonymous is accurately, if anyone knows. But, that smiling mask seems to be a a big part of our historical moment. And I don't think we have one sentence that will answer what it means. But it seems like, Justin, when we talk about Joker, we're talking about something that really has some sort of like political and social utility for people, and that to me is pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Joker has always been the jester has always been the only way that the king, heard the truth. And so the Joker is a repository of repressed knowledge.
Yeah.
And I take your point. I also remind me that
you did just say it in one sentence. That was great. In
one of the comic books that Heath Ledger studied for his role, one of the famous lines was, the mask that Batman wears is his real face. Mm. And so I think for all that smiling and the politics of the smile that you just cataloged, there's also this sense that there's a sense that on the one hand, the person who smiles to you is lying. That's something you have to remember, is that the face of evil won't always look like your stereotype of who the enemy is. Yeah. And that's what helps you to understand that sometimes the true threat to you is coming from the place that you least expect or don't want to know. And then I think the other thing that quote from Joker to the Batman, or that quote that Joker says about Batman, that his mask is his true face, it gets at this play of the idea that Batman isn't a good person on the inside when he takes off the costume, but that his actions are who he is. And that regardless of how he got there, there's not a good guy underneath the monster. He's also just a monster too.
Yeah.
And I think that starts to get at a collision and a conflict that a lot of us have about the violence that's taking place in our society and who its agents are. Because you can accuse any number of US presidents of directing acts of violence against people. And on the one hand, you'll get people defending them by saying any number of things about them as a person, who they are underneath the role that they play. And then that also points back to the idea, though, that if you're the commander in chief and you direct a war crime, aren't you a war criminal, regardless of how eloquent or combustible you are as a person?
Yeah.
So
yeah. And these are truths that seem to be more and more a part of our age too. I mean, when you're talking about like Obama, I think a lot more people see through that smile. And that seeing through that smile seems to be a critical element in a kind of development of political knowledge, for lack of a better term. And
by the same token, though, by the same token, he remains he wears a mask of power that people want.
Yeah.
And I think that's also true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want that smile. God, it's so fun to talk to you, Justin. I know that you wanted to give a brief dedication for this episode because this is our 200th episode. So go ahead. Well,
yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I want to dedicate this episode to my brother Laszlo Scott Kehoe, who was my stepbrother. I met him when he was 2 years old. And when I was in a taxi coming back from LaGuardia Airport last fall when he texted me and he was like, "Have you seen the Joker?" And I was like, "No, I haven't seen it. I wasn't paying any attention to the Joker stuff." And he was like, "I really want you to see it. And once you see it, we can talk about it." And unfortunately and sadly, a couple weeks later, he was taken from us, as a young kid. He was taken way too soon. And I could not bring myself to watch this film for many months. But honestly, I feel that for all its flaws, I understand why he wanted me to watch it. I'm glad I finally did. And I hope he was listening. So Laszlo, that was for you.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate you sharing that with us. That's rough stuff. But I'm glad you were finally able to watch the film and connect with Laszlo that way. So thanks, Laszlo, for pointing us in the direction of our 200th episode. And it's meant a lot to me. I know it's meant a lot to the people who listen to the show to have you share your thoughts with us. So thank you, Justin. I look forward to hundreds more episodes of Nostalgia Trap with you. And thanks for unpacking the Joker with me. I think I'll be thinking about this character for a long time, and I do wonder the future of the Joker. So thanks, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David, and congratulations to you and to Peter for all your hard work, and congratulations on a great show.
All right, as usual, a massive thank you to Justin Rogers Cooper for opening his mind to the idea of the Joker and really kind of giving it a lot of thought and bringing these ideas to the Nostalgia Trap. This was really fun, and 200 episodes. Can't believe it. I hope we do 200 more. Thank you again for all the people who listen to the show and have made the show possible, and especially thank you to the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. It is something that really blows my mind every time I realize that there are people who are actually paying and supporting this type of work, because it means that there are people out there who see the value in it like I do. So thanks so much for that, and we will talk to you again very soon for the next couple hundred episodes. Take care. Bye-bye.